evening, everyone. Good to see you. Redistricting is a constitutionally mandated function that happens every 10 years. It is abstruse. It is sometimes hard to penetrate, which is abstruse. And increasingly, it raises real challenges for our democracy as districts become less and less competitive. We have with us two of the leading experts in journalism on this issue and on the process, Sherpas who can guide us through it, and on the screen you'll hear from experts from each party who have a specific interest in this process, and we're so grateful to have you all. I don't want to take Sophie's thunder away here, so all I'll say is always great to have Dave Wasserman back. He was a great fellow here. He's a brilliant guy and a wonderful part of the IOP family. And now you're part of the IOP family too, Ali, even though you're a Northwestern graduate, so we excuse that. Just a couple of announcements. On Tuesday at 5:30 at the IOP House, we will host a conversation between David Sanger, the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times, and our current IOP Pritzker Fellow, Lotfullah Najafzada, an Afghan journalist who is the director of Tolo News, and Afghanistan's first 24-hour news and current affairs television channel. And that's a discussion I think no one will want to miss. And then on Friday, Congressman Adam Schiff and Senator Tammy Duckworth will be in conversation at the IOP. That will be at 12 p.m. At the Rubenstein Forum. As always, we will invite audience questions. Tonight, after the moderated discussion, we'll open the floor to you. Please line up to ask your questions in front of the microphone, which I guess will be in the center aisle. Is that correct? Yes, I see nodding. And everyone is welcome, but please keep your mask on when you ask your questions. As usual, we will give priority for the first questions to be asked by our students. I'd like to alternate male and female questioners. And just one housekeeping issue, make sure your phones are on silent. And now for the formal introductions of our speakers is Sophie Hare. Sophie is a third-year student at the college, majoring in public policy, and serves on the IOP's Student Advisory Board and has been a leader in the IOP since she arrived here in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Sophie to the podium.
Gotta get my mask off, sorry. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this IOP Speaker Series event, Drawing Districts. It's not just for the Hunger Games. It is my honor to introduce our guests this evening, David Wasserman, Ali Mutnick, Adam Kincaid, and Kelly Burton. David Wasserman is the senior editor for the Cook Political Report, where he is responsible for analyzing U.S. House races, and is a contributor for NBC News. You may also know him from his I've Seen Enough election night tweets calling important races across the country. Ali Mutnick is a reporter covering House campaigns and redistricting for Politico. She previously worked at the National Journal as a House races reporter and Hotline Fellow, and at NPR and the Texas Tribune. Adam Kincaid is the president and executive director of the National Republican Redistricting Trust, or NRTT, and Fairlines America. Prior to starting NRTT, Kincaid worked as special projects director for the RNC, as a political and data director for the NRCC, and as deputy political director and director of policy and research for the Republican Governors Association. Kelly Burton is the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. She previously served as both executive director and political director for the DCCC, and as director of America Forward, a nonpartisan policy initiative working to unite social entrepreneurs and policymakers. Thanks again for joining us, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and it's It's great to be introduced by someone from the state of New Mexico, which is going to be an interesting state to watch this cycle. It's great to be back in a place where gerrymandering is pretty much the state pastime. But hello, nerds. I think it's fair to say that this is like the pinnacle for those of us who study political geography. I was fortunate enough to be a fellow here in 2019, and it's probably the only place in the country where I could get 20 students to voluntarily show up to talk about redistricting for an hour on Monday afternoons for no credit, but it was a lot of fun. And we have a very serious topic to discuss these days. Back 2 years ago, we didn't know that COVID was going to delay the census data, that this was going to be a compressed timeline to draw new maps. And this is an issue that is really becoming existential. Given the geographic polarization of the country, the fact that we have a widening urban versus rural gap, that's meant that how parties and how commissions draw the lines is more important to determining political outcomes than it ever has been. We're fortunate to be joined by some of the greatest minds and one of the best journalists covering redistricting today, Ali Mutnick from Politico, and we're going to get into a conversation in a minute with the top strategists for both parties when it comes to drawing lines for the next decade. But just to set the scene, I wanted to share just a couple slides to illustrate what's at stake in this redistricting round. And if we could pull those up. Do we have them? Great. So first off, this is a map of which states are gaining and losing seats as a result of the census. And there are 7 seats that are changing hands between states. Texas is the big winner in this round, picking up 2 seats. Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon each picking up 1 seat. And then there are 7 states that are losing one seat each as a result of the census tallies. California is losing a seat for the first time since it gained statehood. Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York are each losing a seat as well. One of the most amazing statistics from the census is that New York lost out on the final district in the House by just 26 residents. So it's amazing what a difference just a few census forms make. And, but the more important statistic for the political outcomes in 2022 and beyond is going to be who gets to draw the lines in each state, right? And this is the map of partisan control of redistricting. And this is where Republicans continue to have an edge. They had an even bigger edge 10 years ago. And that essentially won them the House until the blue wave of 2018. But Republicans have the final authority in 20 states that total 187 districts, including some pretty big ones that we're going to talk about tonight, like Texas and Florida and Georgia and North Carolina. Democrats have the final authority over redistricting in 8 states that total 75 districts. But one new feature is the prevalence of commissions. There are 10 states with commissions that total 121 districts. There are 6 states in purple that have split control between the parties that total 46 districts. And then there are 6 states that only have 1 district and fortunately for them can avoid this whole contentious process, at least at the congressional level, although it's still clearly a fight at the state legislative level as well. So with the scene set, first I want to turn to Ali and ask you, great to have you here, what are your key takeaways from having watched this process unfold so far?
I'll give you 2. I think one on the Democratic side, one on the Republican side. One of the most impactful trends I've noticed is the move in blue states towards commissions. This is, a priority of House Democrats, of the NDRC. Their mantra is, let's take the redistricting away from the politicians, let's give it to these independent commissions. But it's become a little contentious in the Democratic Party because there's a contingency that says, well, wait a second, if we're doing this, if we're creating these commissions in our blue states, and Republicans aren't doing it in red states, are we unilaterally disarming? Are we giving away an edge that we should have when the House is up for grabs, when our majority is 5 seats. And I think we've started to see that play out a little bit as redistricting gets on. Colorado is headed for a map that could split 4-4. And there are Democrats who balk at the idea that Colorado, this increasingly blue state, could split its House delegation 50-50. In Virginia today, we've seen the commission struggle there. They essentially adjourned indefinitely today, the commission, unable to agree on a map that's likely going to the state Supreme Court. So I think that's been one of the most interesting trends in 2 very important states, Colorado and Virginia. And on the Republican side, I think I'm most interested, and we'll hear from Adam because he's the real expert on this, but the national message coming out of the Republican Party is draw 10-year maps. Don't overreach, be wary of lawsuits, don't draw districts that aren't going to withstand 10 years of population growth. And hearing that as kind of the party line always stuck out to me as something that was a little bit different than what we think back to 2010, sort of what they describe Republicans as sort of ruthless gerrymandering. And so I'm curious to the extent that national advice is followed statewide. Certainly in Indiana, they didn't carve up Indiana's 1st district in that initial map. That was one of the 2 blue seats in the state. And in Omaha, that's still going to remain a competitive seat, but we still have to see Kentucky, Tennessee, and some of these other states.
Mm-hmm. I'll just offer 2 brief takeaways before we get to Kelly and Adam, our esteemed guests. And the first is I think state Supreme Courts are going to be more important than ever in adjudicating lines. Neither Congress nor the U.S. Supreme Court has stepped in to put any guardrails against gerrymandering, which means that this is increasingly turning into an arms race. And both parties are under intense pressure to maximize their own seats in states that they control. And so I think state Supreme Courts are going to be kind of the final backstop in a lot of cases with regards to partisan gerrymandering, and particularly in states like North Carolina, where the state Supreme Court struck down a Republican-drawn map a couple years ago. Well, that state is gaining a seat. It's going to have to draw a new map this time. Republicans have the power in the legislature to pass it. We'll see what the state Supreme Court there does. Ohio, where the Chief Justice could be the swing vote to block what Republicans draw in Ohio. And there are a few Democratic-controlled states where you could see state court reviews end up in changes to lines. And there are huge numbers of seats at stake in these states, right? And so we could see that be a factor. The second is, I think, the most predictable net effect, and I'll be curious to hear what our guests have to say, is going to be a decline in the number of competitive districts. We only had 36 districts in 2020 that were within 5 points of the national result in the presidential election. Only 36 out of 435. That's down more than 50% versus the election that was held in 2000. So what does that mean for Congress? What does that mean for how Congress functions? I would hypothesize that when we have fewer competitive districts, it means that the parties care less about recruiting candidates with broad appeal in a lot of districts, and that ends up incentivizing a lot of primaries that lead to fringe candidates and ending up winning races. But I want to let Allie ask the first question to our 2 guests, Kelly Burton and Adam Kincaid. And thank you both very much for joining us.
Yeah, Dave and I were just saying we both love interviewing both of you. We're hyping up our guests here, very substantive answers. Okay, starting off, my first question for you guys. What has changed between 2011 and 2021 in redistricting? What are the biggest changes now?
And let's start out with Adam, and then we'll get to Kelly.
The law has changed. The fact that there are 2 committees that focus on this almost full-time has changed. The fact that we're doing these kind of symposiums has changed. Just about everything around redistricting has changed over the last 10 years. When I was at the NRCC doing redistricting in 2011, 2012, I got 1 press call in 2 years over redistricting. That is very different from where we're at now. So there's definitely much more of a public knowledge of redistricting than we've seen since 10 years ago.
I would agree with that. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you, and nice to see you guys, even if not in person. I agree with that. I think the landscape has changed. I would say that this is the most small d democratized redistricting that we've ever had, where you just have so many more tools that are in the hands of the people. You have websites and, map drawing tools that anyone can access. So gone are the days where only a small handful of people in the parties or, in the secret data firms had the redistricting mapping software. I think it's really has opened up access to map drawing and to map analysis, which is exciting. And I think, the commission shift that you saw from Dave's intro is a really notable shift where you are seeing a change away from the really hardcore, staunch Republican trifecta control that we had last time into a shift of something different besides that, right? Especially in some of the battleground districts where last time around the Republicans controlled the redistricting process in, Michigan and Virginia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And those were some of the most gerrymandered maps of the decade. And now in those states, you have either a split control or some kind of commission or some kind of reform like in Ohio that's checking the process a little bit. So there are still a lot of big states the Republicans control, I know we're going to talk about, but I do think the shift in power away from that Republican trifecta control into more of a, split control, Democratic control, or, in some ways, more importantly, commission control is quite different and exciting.
I want to ask a show of hands. If we had held this event on redistricting, a pretty esoteric topic 10 years ago, and you'd been the same age you are now, how many of you would have shown up tonight? So, okay, a handful. But I feel like this topic really has exploded in the public consciousness in the last few years because we have seen lines predetermine so many outcomes. But Kelly, you touched on commissions. I want to get both of your takes on this. We've seen an increase in the number of independent or bipartisan commissions, but they're not all created equally, right? We've got some processes that are more citizen-driven. In California, for example, where it's selected by a combination of application and lottery, and they're prohibited from taking into account political data or where incumbents live when redrawing lines. You've got some that are more politically or politician selected in states like New Jersey and Washington and Arizona, where you have legislative or party leaders who are selecting members. So which commissions what structure has tended to work well? Is this a good thing for the country that we're moving towards commissions? Is it a mixed bag? Adam, let's start with you.
So as far as the commissions that work the best in the country, Washington State's has worked pretty well over the last, they did a good job 10 years ago. Seems to be moving pretty smoothly this time around. But it's one where you've got 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats that are appointed by the legislative leadership. You have a chair that is, presides but has no vote. So the 4, political folks have to agree for a map to come into effect. So you don't have the tiebreaker that all pressure's on that person. Arizona 10 years ago was one of those places where the tiebreaker, the commission chair, sided with the Democrats on just about every single vote. And so that led to a certain amount of controversy over those maps, obviously. So I think Washington's has worked pretty smoothly. Overall, the commissions definitely have been a mixed bag. We've seen some fail, we've seen some succeed, but through all of these, Ali, I think wrote something a week or so ago about this. I mean, they're tough, and you've got people who don't really know a lot about this when they get brought on to do redistricting and be part of these commissions, and they run into realities very quickly about political geography and other things that they would like to consider and not consider that they're not allowed to look at. So it's pretty complicated. These commissioners have a hard time. It's a tough job. Part of that's by design.
Yeah, I agree. The really important point that's being made here is that not every commission is created equally. They're all different. And some models work better than others. And Allie mentioned Virginia today. We've had concerns about the Virginia Commission since the beginning. The writing was on the wall that the structure of this commission was a real problem. And frankly, there was a set of Democrats in the legislature last cycle that tried to fix it. And that was not successful. And so, this one was, I think, kind of set up for some of the challenges that we've seen within the structure of that commission. But as Adam noted, there are commissions that work well. I think overall, Dave, to your question, it is a net positive that we're moving more to commissions. I think, you do want to have the redistricting process really be influenced by the public, because it's the public that is influenced by the maps, and that it really does control a lot of, which people in our democracy have a voice in the outcome of the elections. Redistricting is a big part of determining that, and the people should be involved in that process. So I think commissions create that involvement. They give an opportunity for that involvement. I think part of why the commission process might feel a little unruly is because you are seeing every step of the process along the way. And it's almost like you're seeing the governing as it's happening. But I think on net, it ends up being a more fair outcome. And I think, Dave, to your earlier comment about competitive seats, I think, that's a choice that is made in redistricting, whether to shore up and have more safe seats or whether to try to maintain competitiveness. And I think you see commissions lean more in that direction. Whereas when you have, a partisan control, they may be looking at it through a different lens. So I think for all those reasons, the move to commissions and the move to to public involvement is really good.
I want to ask a quick follow-up on commissions, stay on this topic for one more question. We've seen, some commissions work well, and maybe that goes more quietly, but we've seen some very public blow-ups recently in Virginia. There were 3 Democrats who stormed out of the meeting in protest. They lost the quorum. They had to adjourn. In Colorado, there was a 6-hour Zoom. They were racing to a midnight deadline to vote on the map. They got to 10 minutes before, and they had to do a quick voice vote. There were a lot of tears. There's a lot of public dysfunction going on with them. Do you think we're going to see more commissions by 2031, or will some of this dysfunction and partisan bickering spook people, and where we see either states roll back some commissions or just not lean that way, not move towards them via ballot initiative or by legislative amendment?
Well, I think if you look at the country, for the most part, the states that have the ability for the public to put a redistricting commission either on the ballot or for the public to decide that they want to reform the redistricting process, for the most part, those states have all already done commissions, or a handful of states with a ballot initiative option, where largely because of the pandemic, those reforms were not put forward. But I think ultimately the answer to your question, Allie, is going to depend on legislators, because reforms at this point for additional commissions would have to go through either the legislature or through the voters if you're going to change it, or it's through the legislature if you're going to start a new one. And I think the question is just, if those legislators and legislatures are going to have an appetite for reform. I think, we'll see. Yeah. But I will say, oh, sorry. No, I was going to add something, but I'll hold. Go ahead.
No, go on.
Well, I was just going to add to your point about Virginia. Commissions are not foolproof, right? If you have the motivation to have a partisan outcome, or if you're driven by partisan motives and the commission is just the vehicle through which you express that, then you can do that through the commission, you can do that through the legislature. I think part of what happened in Virginia with those 3 Democrats walking out is they got so frustrated because they were trying to compromise with the Republicans on the commission. They kept presenting these options of compromise, and the Republicans were just like, no, 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 no. And they really held a partisan line, because frankly, it isn't to their advantage for it to go to the state Supreme Court. And they've known that since the beginning in Virginia, which is partly why the structure is set up the way it is for them. So I think that, if they just use the commission for a vehicle for obstruction, that's a knock on those Republican legislators making that choice, not necessarily a knock on, the commission overall or the Democrats who left and feeling very upset about that. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Yep, fine. So you point out rolling back commissions, Allie. New York's Democrats are actively trying to roll back their commission right now. So they've got a ballot measure on the ballot this fall. The legislature referred that tries to lower the threshold for editing maps that come out of the commission that they passed just a few years ago. So yes, there are some efforts out there nationally to roll back these commissions. I don't think that's going to be an easy thing overall. If anyone tries to go and roll them back. Virginia's, it wouldn't shock me if the legislature tried to come up with something to fix it maybe in the next few years. I think everybody on the right and the left, everyone who is kind of from the political world looked at that measure and said, this is designed to fail. I don't think anyone really had a real belief, left or right, that it was going to be a successful commission based off the way it was structured. Tell me if I'm wrong, Kelly, but I'm pretty sure that we were all
We
kind of
agree with you. Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, I think overall you may see some places that try to do it that were not able to do it during the pandemic, but overall, yeah, I don't see any of the commissions going away.
Adam, I just want to pose the question. What is your definition of a fair map?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to turn the question to you, Kelly.
No, good question, David. The problem is that Kelly and I are never going to agree on what a fair map is or is not, which is part of the overall problem, right? But for us, fairness is a legal process, drawing maps that comply with the law, period. We're not out there advocating for proportional representation or anything else. You know, what we're saying is that maps should be drawn in a way that complies with the law in the states and federally. So that's kind of our perspective on redistricting nationally.
And I would say,
Vague definition of fair maps that, you know, just kind of made up to favor me or favor someone else. So.
well, I would say that a definition of fair maps is a map that reflects the will of the people in that area. I think, you know, it's important to step back and remember why we redistrict, right? We redistrict in order to reset the population balance that has shifted over the course of the decade. That's why Dave started with the census. And you know, how people move and how that population shifts requires a rebalancing of the district so that you can fulfill that fundamental criteria of one person, one vote. And so you redraw the line so that they better reflect the public, right? And so part of doing that is then to have districts that reflect the will of the voters and what the voters in that area would want in the outcome of their elections. I think if you do that, then you're you know, getting close to a fair map, which is why the census is a roadmap for how to draw maps, so that you can try to stay as aligned with the people in that area as you can.
Now, in a few minutes, we're going to move to audience questions, so be thinking about what you want to ask. But Allie, next question is yours.
So we'll stay on fair maps. Kelly, I know your main frame here is gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering is a threat to democracy, a form of voter suppression. How do you reconcile that kind of frame with, as Adam mentioned, what some Democrats are planning to do in New York? Would an 8-0 map in Maryland, 8 Democrats or Republicans, be a fair map? Is a 14-3 or 15-2 in Illinois a fair map?
So it's a very good question, and I think it's good that we're spending some time talking about this. So again, the census data is your roadmap for redistricting, right? And what the census data tells us is that this country is becoming more diverse. The population is shifting more into urban and suburban areas, and it's shifting out of the rural areas, right? So if you follow the population that trends along those lines, then you will see an increase in Democratic seats, or at least an increase in competitive seats for Democrats. Because right now, in this moment, in our history, that those voters and that population shift benefits Democrats, right? It might not always, but right this moment, that shift toward more urban, suburban areas, people of color, and fewer rural areas, that is a benefit to Democrats. So right now, if you follow the census data as a roadmap, you will see Democrats pick up seats, regardless of who controls the process. So you should see Democrats pick up seats in Illinois. You should see Democrats pick up seats in New York. Not because they control the process, but because that is what the census data tells you to do in those maps, right? The difference is you also should see Democrats pick up seats in Texas, and you should see Democrats pick up seats in Georgia and North Carolina and Florida and these states where the Republicans are in charge right now, and they are going against the grain of what the census data tells them to do. In Texas, 95% of the growth came from people of color. That's why Texas got 2 seats. And yet, because on this gerrymandered Republican map, the number of white districts increases and the number of minority influenced districts went down. And now you have 0 districts with majority African American districts in Texas. Like that doesn't reflect the data, and it doesn't reflect what should be happening in Texas. So I think part of what you need to look at is not who's in charge, but what should happen in that map based on the census data, and that's what's fair.
But Kelly,
and that's why we're fighting back against that Republican gerrymandering, because it's not aligned with what should be happening in those states.
but Kelly, I've got to ask you, last week, Democrats here in Illinois proposed a map that looks like a toddler threw spaghetti at the wall. And I don't mean your son, Kelly, to be fair, because he's very well-mannered. But
And very cute. Thank you. Yeah.
he is very cute. But it aims to elect 14 Democrats and 3 Republicans in a state where Trump still got around 40% of the vote. And the lines defy or seem to defy contiguity, much as Michael Jordan used to defy gravity. So, Kelly, I have to add, and by the way, it does not create a new Hispanic majority district, even though Hispanics accounted for a huge percent of Chicago's growth and Illinois' growth in the last 10 years. Where's the outrage from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee?
Well, look, I think it's a draft map, right? So I don't think that will be the final map. I think what you're seeing in the states right now is you're seeing legislative leaders and commissioners put out drafts, ask for feedback, have a discussion, and then the maps change. I think that's what's happening in Illinois. I don't think that will be the final map. But it is, again, important to remember the census data, right? So what the census data in Illinois showed is that the rural areas lost population, and the Chicago and the urban areas actually grew in population. So you should see an expansion and a shift in seats in that direction in Illinois. You should. I think the Hispanic numbers that you mentioned is something it sounds like, based on what I'm reading in the press, the legislature is dealing with and looking into. I think you had a tweet on that, Dave, recently. So I think they will iterate. But again, you should see rural areas and Republican districts in Illinois shrink and lose population, and you should see seat increases in the urban and Chicago areas. And that is just a fact of the data. So we'll see where it lands. It's in process, but it's in the direction of what the census data tells you should happen.
Adam, what say you?
On Illinois,
On Illinois.
I look forward to seeing the next iteration. Democrats have already had their first 2 maps thrown out by a federal court in Illinois, and so we'll see what the next one looks like. And I remain open to seeing their revisions and what those may or may not look like. I think if you're following the census as a roadmap in Illinois, you have to look at the fact that where Illinois started. You have Cook County is big enough for about 7 1/3 congressional districts right now. I think it has 10 seats that cut in and out of there. So if you're going to expand those out from Chicago, which is what they're doing, sure, it makes sense you're adding on to that population, but that has to come out somewhere else, right? So downstate, you could have about 7 seats outside of collar counties. Almost all 7 of those will vote Republican. So if you just drew them in a compact whole county sort of way. So I think that, I think the census is a roadmap in the fact that it shows you where people live. But at the same time, politicians are drawing the maps in Illinois, right? So it's not just the census that's the roadmap for fairness.
Well, we touched on Illinois, we touched briefly on New York. Kelly, would an 8-0 map in Maryland be a fair map?
I mean, I think that to the point about the funky lines of gerrymandering and Maryland, the Maryland map is we've made our statements clear on the current map in Maryland. I do think that there is a way to Adam's point. I think seems to me, based on my read of the data, that a fair map in Maryland is similar to what you have now, is closer to a 7-1. I do think that the census data is not necessary. It is a roadmap. It's not the only thing that you look at. You do have to also take into account communities of interest, and communities of interest is a broad term that encompasses a bunch of different factors of how people in the areas live, right? And that's why the public testimony is so important, because you need to hear from people about, what transportation corridors do they use? What's the school district? What are the kind of economic similarities and relationships that different neighborhoods have? And I think those can drive the lines, and that's fine. And I think in Maryland, maybe we took that too far. I think there's a way to, make those districts a little more compact. But I think that you want districts that reflect the communities, that reflect the makeup of the different areas. And, don't be fooled by the lines themselves. I think, Adam has on his website that you want compact districts and clean districts. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good performing, fair district just because it's compact, especially when you're looking at it through a community of interest lens, and does that do right by the people? So it does take you got to kind of weigh all of these factors in together. And that's why the definition of fair might feel a little subjective, but it really is trying to balance all of these dynamics and come up with a map that's right for the people of that area.
For those of you who haven't seen the Maryland congressional map, there is a district that a federal judge the other year likened to a broken-winged pterodactyl lying prostrate across the road. Check it out if you want to see some abstract art. Okay, Adam, I want to drill down on a different state, which is Texas, which is on the verge of becoming, I believe, the 5th state to complete congressional redistricting. Republicans passed a map, 6th? All right, because Arkansas, right? But Texas passed a map that has 25 out of 38 districts that voted for Trump in 2020. It does create a new Democratic vote sink in Austin to try and relieve some of the erosion in the surrounding Republican seats and make those seats safer. But as Kelly alluded to earlier, even though non-whites accounted for 95% of the net population growth in Texas over the last 10 years, it does not draw a new Hispanic majority district. So, Adam, how would you say this map complies with the Voting Rights Act, given that it doesn't seem to create a new opportunity district?
Well, I think that's really the question, David. You used the word opportunity district, right? So one of the big disagreements between conservative and liberal academics, legal academics right now, is whether opportunity districts are required versus majority minority districts are required, right? And so that's something that people with JDs should get on this call and talk about, because I'm not, adequately qualified to go through all the different dynamics of how much of that has changed over the last decade. But I think when you look at the Texas map overall, you're going to see that there are more majority Hispanic seats than there were 10 years ago. You're going to see that the 3 African-American seats, Kelly mentioned before that there weren't any majority African-American seats. There weren't majority African-American seats, last decade. So those 3 seats were preserved. They were, cut up and, spread out. Those 3 seats will still likely elect African-American members of Congress. So, I think that's where we're at with the Texas map. I think it complies with the law. I think it's going to hold up in court. And the record will be pretty clear.
Kelly, what is Democrats' legal path forward in Texas, which is the biggest redistricting prize of the cycle since it's gaining 2 seats?
Well, I think there has already been a lawsuit that's filed in Texas even before the map. I'm sure that once Governor Abbott puts his signature on this map, you will see other litigation that will come, and there will be, varying legal explanations, as Adam is saying, for why this map is unconstitutional and illegal. So everybody, pop your popcorn and get ready to become. We're all going to get passive laws and JDs and redistricting law as we watch the Texas litigation go forward. But I think that it's really notable what Adam just said, because they are not trying to defend the merits of the map. They are locking in power, and they are shoring up their incumbents. They are taking competitive seats off the table, and they're doing it without regard to the actual growth and influence of voters of color in this country. That is a statement of fact. They're doing it they just did it in Texas. Adam mentioned Arkansas has already passed. You have a map in Arkansas that the Republican governor won't even sign because he is embarrassed by the gerrymandering of Pulaski County, which is where Little Rock is. It splits it 3 ways. The African-American community in Little Rock is very upset about this and how it dilutes their power. And the governor is making a choice to sort of with the opposite of a pocket veto, where he's not signing it and allowing it to become into law because he doesn't want to endorse it. So that's the reality of what you're seeing with these Republican maps. Those are choices that they are making, and we'll let courts decide whether that's in fact legal. We think it's not.
All right, I want to move away from the law into data. I've posed this question to both of you before, but we've kind of left the theoretical and now we're in the practical because we're drawing maps. We're in the midst of one of the biggest political realignments right now of the Trump era, and you have data, especially in certain regions of the country, South Texas, South Florida, where the partisan data looks completely different from 2016 to 2020, and so you have a lot of different divergent data points to use when you're drawing a map. We'll use South Florida as an example. Florida's 26th district voted for Hillary Clinton by 16 points in 2016 and was a Trump +5 4 years later. So when you're sitting down to draw these areas, how do you reconcile these different data points, and what are the trends that you think are going to keep for the next 10 years and ones that you think are flukes?
You can go first.
You want to go first? I feel like I've gone first the last couple times. Go ahead.
So first off, it's never going to look at one election when drawing maps using political data. That was actually the problem we had 10 years ago, was that all we had was McCain-Obama numbers from 2008. Like, that was all the data set the RNC had at the time. So for redistricting. So that's one. You can't really build a decade's worth of maps off of one election or one election cycle. So you have to look at more than that. I think the question that everyone's asking is, does the Rio Grande Valley continue to trend right? Does South Florida hold? Does it go back to the sort of numbers we saw in 2000 and 2004 when George W. Bush did really well in South Florida, right? Are we going back to that? Yeah, you look at California. Hispanics voted, at higher rates for the recall than in other places in the state. So it's not just one part of the country; it's happening all over the place. The other part of that, though, is suburban, America. It was red for a very long time, then got pretty purple and looked kind of blue in the last couple election cycles. So the question is where that goes. If the polling's believed in Virginia, then the suburbs are bouncing back pretty quickly. And we'll see what the Virginia governor's race looks like in a couple weeks, and those results may tell us a lot about where the country's headed. If Joe Biden's at 37% in Iowa, that tells you a lot about overall where the country may be headed, at least for the next 4 years. So, I don't think we can really forecast 10 years in the future, and I think that's kind of something that got into people's heads after 16 and 20 is that, hey, we do have these realignments. We're in a pretty volatile electorate right now. It shifts constantly, but we were kind of in a lull for a long, long time, for several decades, where it was kind of the same sort of electorate. Then Barack Obama came around and really disrupted that. But, that was one disruption, then we had another disruption not 8 years later. So, it's kind of hard to forecast 10 years in the future. I think we can see right now where the electorate's going to be in 22 and probably in 24. But past that, it will be determined in large part by who the president is in 2025.
And I would just add, I totally agree that just in general for, election targeting and looking at the battlefield of the, House races or state legislative races, you absolutely can't look at just one election. And I think data gives us the ability to look at the kind of cumulative effect of elections over time, and that's a good thing. And you don't want to ever just take something in a snapshot. And certainly don't ever want to take voters, make presumptions about voters, either demographically or geographically. But this is why gerrymandering is such a problem, right? Because the point of democracy is that all voters' voices count the same, right? And the thing that gerrymandering does is it distorts that reality so that some votes count more and less than other votes. And what should happen, right, Allie, is that as elections change, as voters change their mind, then their representation should also change, right? And so if you have a dynamic where, they liked the Democrats and now they like the Republicans, the election should reflect that. And gerrymandering prevents that. It predetermines the outcome so that what you see, and this is what we saw over the course of the last decade before 2018, is that the voters were telling you one thing with their vote, and the outcome of the election was not generating that result. And that's why you had, in Ohio, where Republicans consistently get 52, 54% of the House vote, but they consistently get 25% of the seats for the decade, even in 2018, right? With the 2018 Trump wave, the wall of gerrymandering in Ohio was so high, the Democrats got 0 new seats. That's not fair. That's not reflective of the voters. It doesn't allow for the changes that may happen in the electorate to then also change the outcome of our elections. And that's why it's such a problem to have these gerrymandered maps.
I think one thing we can agree on, all 4 of us, is that there are a lot of competing trade-offs here. Do you prioritize proportionality, competitiveness, compactness? These are all factors that parties are wrestling with, that commissions are wrestling with. But one implication that I want to drill down on before we open it up and come prepared with your questions in a minute. There are new Voting Rights Act implications this time that are new versus 2011. This is the first redistricting cycle since Shelby v. Holder rendered inoperative Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially established a preclearance regime where the Justice Department reviewed maps to ensure that they follow the VRA. How does that affect how you think about both maps that your parties are passing, maps that you're challenging in court, and what states in particular are you going to be watching in addition to those we've already discussed? Kelly, you want to start off?
Sure. Well, I do think that the Shelby case that kind of dismantled preclearance and weakened the VRA is a real problem. And I think that's why you are seeing Democrats in Congress fight to restore the VRA, to restore preclearance. I think these 2 bills that are going through Congress right now, the Freedom to Vote Act, which bans partisan gerrymandering, which is a whole bunch of very cool and important things in protecting our democracy, expanding access to voting, preventing the election subversion that we're seeing by the Republicans in the states, is a very important bill. And then also in parallel, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does do not to get too far in the weeds here, but in that Shelby case, they basically said like Congress needs to do this, like it's not our job, and Congress needs to come up with a new formula. And so what you have right now is Congress taking that mantle and trying to do that, and you have just literally today on the Freedom to Vote Act, Republicans blocking that from happening. So I think that it's what you're seeing from Democrats is wanting to restore these fundamental protections of our democracy, and to make sure that people have the strength in their vote. And I think you're seeing the Republicans block that because they know that that will hurt them politically, because again, they're trying to sort of strengthen the voice of some voters over others in terms of who determines our election. So the VRA is not the only tool in the toolbox. There's a lot of ways to fight back. And I think from the public pressure and the participation to the lawsuits you mentioned, Dave, state Supreme Courts, I think are going to be really important. I agree with you. But all of these factors are important. And I think if we do right by our democracy, we would restore all of these protections. And that's what I think you're seeing Democrats try to do.
And Adam, do you believe Democrats are using the VRA as a backdoor to try and gain more seats for Democrats? Or do you believe that there is a fair threshold for what constitutes a minority opportunity district that should be adhered to?
Sure. So first off, on the VRA itself, Republicans and Democrats voted together to renew the VRA during the Bush administration.
Right.
It happened in the 2000s. The difference this time.
Right. So what happened in the House? Why you got 0 votes? Zero Republican votes?
Well, I mean, Kelly, how much did the Democrats and Republicans talk about what we do in that bill? Where we're at right now with the VRA and everything else, I mean, yes, preclearance is gone, but that doesn't mean that people don't still have to comply with Section 2. They don't still have to draw maps that, overall comply with the law. And I think that's where, we're telling people to do that, to follow the law, to look at where the law is heading. As far as how you define what is or is not a required seat under the VRA, David, I think you have to look. It's unfortunately there's not one rule, right? I think everyone would be kind of okay if there was one rule that we could follow and go, okay, this is where it is, these are the lanes and everything else, and this is where we go. This is where we're driving. The problem is that there's not. And a big part of the challenge with drawing minority districts in the country is that it's very localized, right? Like some parts of the country, you have African Americans that are being elected in the state legislatures in 40-something% districts, right? But you have other parts of the country where to elect African Americans to legislature or the Congress, you need significantly more than that. And that's why there's a lot of academic research and things that goes into these when legislatures are building a record to figure out what they're supposed to draw and how they're supposed to comply. So I can't give you one rule because there is no one, which is what makes this so complicated. And it's part of what Kelly's talking about, and they'll spend a good bit of time and energy litigating that and talking about it over the next few years, and we're going to do the same thing. And so the real question is where the Supreme Court is going to take redistricting law when it comes to racial gerrymandering. We don't know that at this point in time.
All right. There's a mic.
Can I just add
go ahead.
one other thought on this? Apologies. Because I think it kind of adds to what's interesting and maybe combines this litigation VRA question and the data question from earlier. I think one of the things that you're seeing Republicans do in the states is to turn off race data as a almost like foolproof against the potential for, this line or this dynamic that Adam's talking about where, it's not a hard line of how much did race determine the outcome of those maps? And I think that you're seeing Republicans interpret that by saying, well, we didn't use race data at all. And I just want to kind of have all of us be very thoughtful about that approach as like, are we sure? Because, in the same way that like, saying, we're colorblind doesn't eradicate racism in this country. Just turning off race data doesn't necessarily, alleviate the dynamic of not taking into account people of color and also of not doing right by those communities, not only because of their race, but because of all of the dynamics of that community of interest. Again, I think it's also a sort of false pretext to think that these legislators don't know the racial makeup of their states, and just because they turn off race data, they like all of a sudden are blind to that. So I think that's been an interesting trend of this cycle, is this notion of Republican legislators just turning off race data and thinking that that's totally going to protect them in court. I think it's more complicated than that.
I'll note that we're not advocating for that. It's for the record.
All right. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, we have one, and please tell us. Yes? Okay. All right. Don't be shy. Yes, tell us your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm a fourth-year student in neuroscience from Iowa City, Iowa. And my question's about redistricting in Iowa. It seems like a really weird system to have a commission and then what the commission spits out is voted on. But I guess my question is, it looked like in that first map, it was maybe favorable for Republicans in the state house and state senate, but less favorable on the national level. So what does that conversation maybe look like in terms of deciding which of those things to prioritize when you're voting on a map like that?
Iowa, this is essentially like the epitome of fair districting. Where is it? Adam, you want to take a first stab?
Well, I'll say the Iowa congressional map that came out for that first round was Nancy Pelosi's dream map for Iowa. It left her one Democrat in basically the exact same seat she's currently in and created a brand new solid Democrat district in Eastern Iowa. So that was Nancy Pelosi's dream map for Iowa. On the legislative side, they look at all sorts of different things. They look at, but yeah, overall, you had one district that was a figure 8. I don't know if you looked at that with the legislative maps, but they took 2 counties, put them together, had clusters of districts in 2 towns, and there was literally a district that was a figure 8 around those other ones. And just overall, I think the legislature looked at it and said, we're not going to go with this, we're going to go with another round and see what the next one looks like. The other thing I will note, though, on the maps that it's not really a commission, it's Ledge Services that they produced for the first round of maps. The 4th and the 3rd were pretty compact. They had low deviations. The 1st and the 2nd did not. they were not compact. They were north-south versus more of a quadrant base that we've seen in the past in Iowa. And it was actually really easy to just turn that just a little bit, not changing 3 or 4 at all, and having a very, very compact 1 and 2 that had lower deviations. So I don't think that 1 and 2 actually complied with Iowa's rules when it came to compactness and everything.
Yeah, the Iowa model is a really interesting model. And I think there has been this sentiment that Iowa is this like awesome, like Dave said, the pinnacle of fair redistricting. I think the thing to note about the Iowa process is, as Adam said, it's called the LSA, the Legislative Services Agency. They draw the map first. It's sort of like a commission in that, it's not with legislators, it's not with legislative interest. There's a whole bunch of factors that they can't and don't take into account. And then they present that map to the legislature, and the legislature has the opportunity to vote it up or down. And they can do that 3 times. And if by the 3rd time the legislature votes it down, then the legislature just takes over, right? And so, in a state like New York, people are like, why wouldn't the legislature just take over? And in a state like Iowa, the culture's like, the legislature would never take over, right? And so it's more like the culture that I think has really elevated the Iowa model to be such a pinnacle of fair redistricting, because they have never gotten to this 3rd point, this 3rd step where the legislature votes it down and then takes it over. So the thing that we're watching for is this a partisan driven Republican legislature that is commiserate with other Republican driven legislatures that we're seeing in the country, where they are just moving this to the 3rd step so that they can take it over? That would be a bombshell in Iowa. That would be unheard of. And so I think it's not unheard of for the process to go to the 2nd round and give the LSA an opportunity to make some of these changes. That's what we're seeing now. But we're very hopeful that the LSA will make those edits, that's fine, and that the legislature will do what it's always done and pass this LSA map and not, do the full power grab and pull it in-house. That's what to watch for in Iowa.
We'll see the next round tomorrow.
Yeah.
Hey.
But I think it gets at, you've kind of touched on an interesting tension between the state legislators and the congressional delegations. And this is all happening at the same time, but they have conflicting interests. Like earlier this year, we had a really dramatic situation in Oregon where the Republican minority was threatening to deny quorum so that Democrats couldn't pass the new set of maps. And from my understanding, talking to people in Oregon, their state legislative maps were pretty good, congressional maps not as good. But if they denied quorum and they missed the deadline, then those state legislative maps would have been drawn by the Oregon Secretary of State, who is considered to be a progressive Democrat. And so they actually came back, provided quorum to pass those maps, maybe at the expense of a congressional seat or 2, but because they wanted better state legislative seats than they thought they'd get otherwise. So it's an interesting dynamic.
I want to make sure we get to as many people as possible, so we'll try and do these rapid fire. Yes.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a first-year student here at the college, and I want to frame my question within the context that several of you have alluded to, which is that historically Democratic states and Democratic voters have been more supportive of redistricting commissions, yet there's kind of been, especially within the last year, a shift as there's this perception that Democrats are unilaterally disarming themselves. So I want to ask, within this context, do y'all perceive the future and like the shift in the next decade to be a sort of pressure point for Republicans to also embrace commissions, or do you think that there is going to be a continuance of this polarization in the process?
I think it's a great question. Adam, you want to start us off?
As far as a pressure point on Republican states to impose commissions, is that I think you have to get past the fact that most Republicans believe that independent redistricting commissions, for Congress at least, are probably unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has had one ruling on that. A lot of our folks still don't agree with it. So that's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is you have to look at these commissions across the country. They are a lot of them are dysfunctional. But if you look at Colorado's commission specifically, Colorado is set up in a specific way, had certain criteria. It went through that process and created a map that was not as democratic as the Democrats wanted it to be. You had 4 pretty good Democratic seats, 3 Republican seats. One of those is kind of, it could degrade over the decade, I can see pretty easily. But the fact that it wasn't a 5-3 map or something that had a much clearer Democratic tilt to it meant that it needed to be challenged by, I don't know how many different people who filed, got into that. The new Colorado 8 is probably the most competitive seat in the country. It's like 49-49 for everybody, if you look election after election after election. And so it's a really interesting district in Colorado, but you immediately saw that people challenged it because Colorado's result wasn't Democratic enough. If you look at Michigan, Michigan's commission right now is actively trying to gerrymander to create 7 Democrat-leaning districts in the state. The commissioners are openly talking about this during the hearing process. I mean, I think Allie, David, both of you have heard some of that as you've kind of looked at Michigan, where you have people trying to connect Grand Rapids with Kalamazoo just to create a Democratic seat in Western Michigan. I mean, these sorts of things, the commissions overall, I don't think that they have credibility in red states, and I don't think you're going to see a big push to implement.
I love that we're talking
add to
about
this?
district lines in Kalamazoo. Yes, Kelly.
Well, I was just going to add that, I dispute what he said about Colorado and Michigan, but just quickly, I think it's important to note that in Colorado, as we've been talking about, all the commissions are different. The briefs that are with the Supreme Court right now are part of the Colorado process. So the Colorado process runs through the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has a review step in this commission. So it's not like Virginia or some of these states were like, oh my God, the Supreme Court's taken over, everyone's challenging the maps to the Supreme Court. It's not that. It's the Supreme Court is the final step, and you can talk to the Supreme Court and submit your opinion, same like you can to a commission. And I think what you saw with the 8th from us and others was feedback to the commission, feedback to the Supreme Court on some pieces that that they could improve upon, because that's their role in the Colorado process. So that's all par for the course. And look, I think that, I think that this is a really important point that you're hearing from Adam, because it goes to what Allie mentioned at the top about the top takeaways. Her top takeaways, 1 is Democrats want commissions, but 2 is that Republicans want 10-year maps, and that they really see the redistricting process as the way to lock in 10-year maps. And commissions make it harder to do that because you don't have just hardcore control where you can do whatever you want. And the Republicans want to protect that. They want to preserve that, because what we're seeing is in the states where they do have that control, they are actively choosing to shore up a 10-year map to make their incumbents safer, to take the competitive seats off the table, and to make it so that no maps change hand in that state, regardless of what the voters want. That is their goal. They are telling you that. So the lack of support for a commission is almost like a lack of support for the voters and the people. And it's just it's how they get to their goal of the 10-year solidified map. And Dave, you mentioned competitive seats. The lack of competitive seats in redistricting is a choice. It doesn't have to be that way. You could have, like what Adam is saying in Colorado, where the 8th is competitive. Great. It should be. It's Colorado. If it's 5-3, if it's 4-3-1, if that ultimately ends up as 6-2, great. That reflects the state. Why is that bad? And we're not scared of the voters. We're not scared of competitive seats. And we think that if the maps were fair around the country, you would actually see a 40% increase in the number of competitive seats in this country off of what we have right now. That is what should happen. So it's just, these are choices that are being made. They're not predetermined.
I will note that in Illinois, there's been gallons of ink spilled over the last several days about Democrats' efforts to shore up Lauren Underwood and not maybe degrade Marie Newman's seat as much as they did in that first draft. So it's not just Republicans that are looking to shore up vulnerable incumbents. Democrats are doing the exact same.
Well, part of that ink in Illinois is saying Democrats are gerrymandering, there's too many seats. And they're also saying there's not enough Democratic seats. They didn't shore up their incumbents. So great. That's what's happening.
All right.
Hi there, guys. Thanks for running this event. My name is Michael. I'm at DePaul. Sorry, guys, but I'm a political science student there. Okay, so let me just preface this first. I'm pretty against commissions personally. I think the politicians should be drawing. But with that, I like the Ohio referendum that we mentioned, and specifically the county splitting limitations. And my question basically is if you all think that the amount of times that counties are split and stuff is indicative of a gerrymandered map, basically, because we talked about Pulaski County being cracked in 3. Winnebago County is cracked in 4 with Rockford in the current map, and Stark County, in the proposed map, that's when Winnebago's cracked in 4, and in the current map, Stark County, which has like 6,000 people in it, is cracked into two. So I'm just asking if you all think that the amount of times counties are split is indicative of a gerrymander, basically.
This student knows his counties. All right. Adam?
Dave, I feel like you should answer that.
Yeah.
Hey, look.
You're talking to the master here. Go ahead.
Well-
Take it away.
Hey, we have existing political subdivisions that could be used as building blocks. I kind of don't see why we don't use them more often. That's my personal feeling. But Kelly?
Well, look, I think it's like we've been talking about all night. You have to look at a multitude of factors on what counts as a fair map and what is determinative of a fair map. I think in some states like Iowa, you actually have to keep counties together. In other states and in Ohio, they tried to be directive of how many times you could split counties as a way to prevent gerrymandering. I don't think it is in and of itself the metric or one metric. I do think you have to look at multiple factors, especially when you're trying to balance for population while also reflecting the communities of interest in that state. So it's something to look at. It's not the only thing to look at. And kind of like the targeting that Adam was talking about earlier, you have to look at a multitude of factors together to come up with an interpretation of a map, not just one thing like county splits.
So I'll have a couple things to say on this. First off, we did some research on this a couple of years ago. Voters look at whole counties and they don't think that that's true. Voters like to look at districts and understand why they were drawn the way they were drawn. If you show them a map of Maryland, they will say that's gerrymandering. If you show them a map of Nebraska, they'll say, oh, that looks like a fair play, right? So generally speaking, or Iowa, they'll think, oh, that looks like a pretty straightforward map. Obviously, you can't draw whole county maps within deviation rules all over the country like Iowa. Iowa's a unique case in West Virginia too. But overall, though, I think that most voters look at it and they think, okay, that looks clean, so that makes sense. I understand why that was drawn that way, so that's not gerrymandering. As far as being able to look at it, though, for those of us that do this all the time, you can't really look at county splits as the giveaway for gerrymandering or not. There's a lot of other things you weigh. But I will say that I think David and I agree on the counties as building blocks for districts. And we've talked about this a few different times, haven't we, David? But the reality is that if you wanted to change the way America redistricts, it would make sense to do it in a way where you're building off of jurisdictional lines. But you also have to do other things, like taking away people's ability to use political data when drawing those maps. And drawing maps that are just based off of population, city and county lines, compactness scores that are defined, not kind of nebulous, and then build from there. And I think there's a way to do that, but it's complicated. It would take probably decades to get that through the House. But there is a way to do it.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Can I just say one thing here? I just
Quickly.
You can draw Arkansas without having to split any of the counties. So splitting Pulaski County is completely unnecessary. That's it.
Well, there may be judges who agree with you. We'll find out.
I agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And apparently the Republican governor has some concerns. All right. Yes.
Hello, my name's Hugh, and I'm a first year in the college, and I was wondering specifically.
And where are you from?
I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland.
I've heard of it. Okay.
Okay, and I was wondering about Texas and what parts of the map might get struck down in a potential legal challenge.
All right. Kelly, what are you hoping for on that front?
I think that, again, if you use the census data as a roadmap, I think that what you saw in Texas is large numbers of growth of people of color, particularly in the urban and suburban areas. And I think what you saw the Republicans do is pack those voters into a few number of districts in order to shore up the neighboring Republican districts around those urban cores. And I think that they didn't have to do that. I think that was a choice that they made. And I think that if you look at the voting power and you look at the growth trends of communities in those areas, that is not reflective of what the election and what the line should look like, and the outcome of those elections under these lines it doesn't necessarily reflect where the voters want the elections to go. So I think, again, census data as a roadmap, what should happen. I think those kind of urban and suburban packing that Dave talked about at the top with Texas is not commensurate with what we should have seen in the data.
Adam, quickly, why are you confident that the Texas map will hold up in court?
Because it complies with the law and will hold up in court.
All right, see.
Succinct.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a first year at the college from Michigan, and this may be
Where in Michigan?
Zeeland. It's next to Holland, if you know where that is.
Okay, yeah.
So this may get at a larger question, but I was just wondering, because we mentioned how there's this increasing shifts, and there's geographic polarization, and there's this almost life or death kind of weight on redistricting, redistrict matters. So I was just wondering, as redistricting experts, do you think that's a tenable situation, or if in the future, if this pressure sustains itself and keeps building, might see greater changes to redistricting, multi-member districts or redistricting more often, or something that changes how we view it?
Feel free to jump in if you want to as well.
I mean, I think in interviewing people, especially on the commission front, of why are so many of these commissions having so much trouble, why are they so dysfunctional, I feel like members have said to me, if we did this 10 years ago in a different political climate, maybe we could come to an agreement. And there are delegates in Virginia who would say, there was a quote in a story I did with a colleague recently where he said, it's a betrayal of your tribe to compromise with Republicans right now. We're in such a polarized and intense climate. And so I think if you can't reach compromise, it makes the commissions a lot harder, and it makes everyone drive to their corners when they have the pen and the ability to control in their state. I don't know if you guys would agree.
And we've got Ottawa County, Michigan in the House, right? You both mentioned Michigan, which has a new commission in place. And Adam, you alluded to Democrats attempting to pass a map in which 7 out of 13 districts are Democratic. But Joe Biden did win Michigan narrowly. Would 7 out of 13 be proportional for Michigan? Or would that be a gerrymander?
Well, if you look at the Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo district, I would say that's an intentional gerrymander to create a political result in that map. So overall for Michigan, you've had a state that has some pretty good swings in its maps, right? The electorate there has shifted over the decade in various ways, shapes, and forms. So we exited the decade at 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats in a toss-up state. That seems reasonable, right? For a commission to look at that, seems like that makes sense. But overall, I really think the Michigan Commission is going to land in a spot where we have 4 or 5 reliable Republican seats, 4 or 5 reliable Democrat seats, and then 3 to 5 competitive districts. I think that's where the commission will ultimately realize they need to be. But Michigan also has precedent that the Supreme Court has upheld to keep city and county lines whole. And the commission is intentionally splitting those in order to try to create a Democratic district in Western Michigan, because they're having a hard time doing it coming out of Detroit. And so, we'll see how that plays out.
Are there any commissions, just as an add-on to that you guys think are operating unfairly right now, or that you're nervous about? Kelly?
Well, I think part of what happens with commissions, and Adam is alluding to this, is that you see the work happening, right? It's high degrees of transparency. So what you're seeing in Michigan is you're seeing the changes, and what he's calling gerrymandering is them really trying to take into account the feedback that they're getting from their experts and from the community and reconcile all of these tensions real time, and they do it in the public. And so you're also seeing it shift and change, right? And I think that's fine. That's good. It's part of the process. I think, I frankly have some concerns about Arizona right now, because what we're seeing consistently is the independent chairs side with the Republicans every single time.
Hey,
it's not
she sided with the Democrats 10 years ago.
Well, but a lot of that was on process. These are on maps. And she is making map choices and map votes with the way that they're doing their process. And so anyway, I don't want to get ahead of Arizona. It's also in the middle of its process. We'll see. But to your point about, are there any red flags? I think an open process like Michigan, where they're openly trying to work it out, and you're seeing those shifts among the commissioners, is different than when you see a commission just consistently skew one direction. I think that's just something to watch out for. So we'll see.
Adam?
The final map in Arizona last decade was drawn in the living room of one of the commissioners by the executive director of the Arizona Democratic Party. If you don't
The
believe
final
me,
map in Arizona is a 5-4, which is commensurate with the state.
if
So
you
it's a
don't believe
fair
me-
map that reflects the state. And if Arizona ends up with a 6-3, that is not reflective of the state, period. I lived in Arizona. I went to school there. That is not that is not a fair map for the people of Arizona. And if the commission walks this to a 6-3, that is not fair.
If you don't believe me, you can read the deposition where the executive director of the Arizona Democratic Party said that he drew the maps in the living room of one of the commissioners 10 years ago.
And it was a fair map that reflects the state. So right? I mean, again, if you look at how these maps should be drawn to reflect the community, that we have a fair map in Arizona, and we should have another one coming out of this commission.
And the tiebreaker sided with the Democrats every single time 10 years ago in Arizona. I don't recall a Democrat complaining about it.
All right, I'm going to go to the final question.
We'll
to
do
Ally.
a lightning question. Which state are each of you respectively most anxious to see the final map either commission drawn or drawn by the opposite party? You can only pick one state. Which do you think your candidates are going to fare the worst under whatever the final lines are?
Oh, the one word. Okay.
Yeah, the one you're most worried about. We're keeping with the anxiety theme here.
High levels of anxiety on this panel. Look, I think that if you have maps where there are competitive seats where both sides can compete, that's good. If you walk out of a map that's already locked, if this Texas map stays, then you have a dynamic where there are 0 competitive seats in Texas for the decade. Is that good? Is that good for the people of Texas? Is that good for the political infrastructure of Texas and the pipeline, all these awesome young people in the audience that might want to work on campaigns? There's nothing in Texas. So is that good? No. So I think competitiveness and the ability to compete is something to look for in all of these maps.
So Kelly's is Texas, Adam.
Texas 15 and Texas 28 are competitive now. There are 2 competitive seats in the Rio Grande Valley. There will be a 3rd competitive seat in Texas by the end of the decade in Texas 34. As far as, I guess we talked about the map you've already seen. I guess the one I've got the most anxiety over is California, just because it's California. And we already have lots of good evidence that the commissioners are meeting with various people in California off the record and are trying to hide from FOIAs and everything else about who they're meeting with and who they're drawing lines with. We have a pretty good idea who it is, but we're already seeing that in California. So we'll see how that unfolds over the next 2 months.
All right. Well, Ally, I don't know about you, but I've seen enough.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I want to say, this is obviously a very fraught, complicated topic. I think it's easy to hate on gerrymandering, and it's harder to address. But I hope that we've just touched the tip of the iceberg of the complexities involved here. I think it's something that deserves our attention and engagement, no matter your point of view, because it is so consequential. I think more consequential than a lot of the other aspects of election administration that we argue strenuously about, to how our members of Congress and our legislators are elected. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think you summed it up really well. And we appreciate you guys coming and engaging in a thoughtful way. I feel like we normally talk to you separately. It's been a while since we've seen you together, so some good back and forth.
And even though you are representing your parties and you are advising your respective coalitions on maps, I want to thank you for engaging in a respectful discussion tonight, because I do think that that you are some of the best, brightest, but also most intellectually candid representatives on this topic in your party. So thank you for being part of this discussion, and we look forward to continuing to stay updated as we watch this unfold in the months ahead. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. One big round of applause for our guests. Thank you. And thank you, Allie. Have a safe trip home. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, y'all. Good to see you, Kelly.
Thanks, everyone. You too.
Take
Later.
care.